Hi, my name is Felisa Tibbits, and I'm Chair in Human Rights Education at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and also UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Higher Education. I am also Director of HREA, Human Rights Education Associates, which was one of the co-founders of the HRE USA. So I'm especially pleased to be able to address you today, albeit virtually at your conference. And I so much appreciate the invitation from the organizers to join you and for facilitating this virtual contribution. So let me share my screen and get started. I have been asked to address the topic of human rights and the environment and education, which is a tall order under any circumstances, but especially when I only have just a few minutes to address this with you. So I'm going to be sharing some key ideas with you that I hope will be a positive contribution to your own thinking, discussions at the conference, and maybe your planning as educators as you move ahead. So obviously, maybe it goes without saying, we are in an extraordinary crisis for our times, and it's imperative that we have some kind of concerted actions individually and as societies and globally across many, many sectors to address this, including the education sector. So what I'm going to do today, very briefly, is to overview some of the key human rights standards. Some of them are soft policies that we can find that connect up human rights and the environment. And then I'm going to very briefly present some of the considerations for education to promote climate action, focusing especially on UNESCO's work right now, which is what I'm personally involved in. And I think, and I hope that you will find interesting for your own work. So if you already don't know this, there is actually a Sustainable Development Goal that is devoted exclusively to climate action, SDG 13. And the target 13.3 specifically recognizes the role of education and learning in enhancing capacities of individuals and institutions and their societies to essentially address climate change. So that is a very powerful message of the importance of addressing climate action from the member states and the United Nations. Maybe it goes without saying, but human rights and the environment are really closely intertwined. On the one hand, we know that some of the negative effects of climate change affects the human rights, many human rights of the individuals who are affected, especially those who are most vulnerable within their societies or societies themselves that are more vulnerable in terms of their geographical position, for example. So human rights essentially can't be enjoyed without a safe, clean, and healthy environment. On the other hand, if we think about trying to have coordinated actions within and across societies, you could make an argument that human rights, along with rule of law and good governance, is really, really essential for helping us to move collectively forward in addressing the climate change crisis that we have today. So how can the human rights framework help us to address climate change, and vice versa? How can climate change help to highlight human rights and the framework of all those human rights that are affected negatively by climate change? On the one hand, at the United Nations, we now have something called the right to a healthy environment. And even if you've been thinking that that was already a right, in fact, it only became officially a kind of right, although not a legally binding one through a UN resolution last year. So last year, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution recognizing the right to a healthy environment. And this was on the heels of a similar resolution that had passed the year before at the Human Rights Council. So this is specific to humans having a right to a healthy environment. But again, it's a very powerful language and is a very timely one, of course, as well. There's something else that's happening around rights and environment and healthy environment, and that is litigation. We are seeing not only in the United States, but in other countries as well, young people specifically taking their governments to court for their failure to protect their right to a healthy environment in the future. And just this year, amazing, in Montana, in the case Held versus the state of Montana, the youth prevailed, and a judge made a decision that they in fact had their right to a healthy environment compromised due to the fossil fuel policies of Montana. And Montana will have to change those policies and hopefully also undertake policies that support clean energy. This is not the only litigation that is underway in the United States. There's many, many others, but this is the first that has been resolved in this way. So it's very exciting. And again, they may not be using here the UN General Assembly resolution, but certainly they might. But it still thinks that we can still talk about the notion of rights, for example, and healthy environment. The other thing that's happening at the United Nations, which is more kind of under discussion, but I think it's worth putting out there for you to consider, which is basically the rights of non-human living things. So there is under discussion a Universal Declaration on Animal Welfare. And I know if you're like me, when I think about what's happening to the planet, I care as much about what's happening to animals and other living things as humans, if I may be honest. And so I am really welcoming this notion that we're going to recognize the rights of other living things in some ways. It's called beyond anthropocentrism. And I don't know how that's going to be happening, because typically human rights are organized in such a way that we can have litigation. I mean, that's sort of the nature of having these rights. That's also was one of the problems of moving from individual to collective rights was, well, how do you have a group of people have, litigation in a court of law? But we've overcome that problem. So perhaps we'll also be able to have some litigation that's related to non-humans as well. So this is also something interesting that's been happening, and might be also interesting for you to discuss with your students, as well as some of the litigation that's been brought by youth, say, here in the United States around the right to a healthy environment. Let me shift gears now and talk a little bit about education and intersections with current environmental challenges. So there's two sides, I think, of how we can think about education and the environmental challenges. The first, of course, is that if there are natural disasters as a result of climate change, this can impede access to education because of displacement. And there's more and more of these kinds of displacements happening because of phenomena we can associate with climate change. And you've probably been following that in the news. So I don't need to go into detail here, but it's more often and it's at wider scale. Obviously, on the other side, the other thing about education we can consider is what we as educators and our national education systems might do to promote readiness for climate change, including individual behaviors related to sustainable lifestyles, related to policies that encourage private sector to move from fossil fuel to alternative energies and so forth. So lots there. Let me first begin very briefly by saying that the United Nations is also linking up climate action with education. And I'll begin at the beginning of my slide. The Youth Action for Quality Climate Change Education has been underway for years now. You've probably been following it. And this has been captured actually in some declarations and policies by the United Nations, and specifically UNESCO, which is really cool. And I think it's partly because of that youth activism that UNESCO has moved from just education for sustainable development, for which there's a long history at UNESCO. They've moved from that specifically to a focus on climate change, climate action within ESD. So we have SDG 4.7, by the way. Those of you who are human rights educators, which I assume are most of you, probably already know that HRE is captured inside of SDG 4.7's target. Within Education for Sustainable Development, you'll find a sort of a catch-all of global citizenship education, peace education, and HRE. The UN also has a framework convention on climate change, which has an element where they recognize the essential role of education. So anyway, there is some support for thinking about climate change education at the UN level. And UNESCO has gotten increasingly interested in this specific aspect of ESD. They commissioned a study which came out a couple of years ago, which shows, perhaps not surprisingly, but depressingly, that almost half of the national curriculum frameworks that that they researched, 47% didn't have any focus on climate change, and another 40% only had a very, very minimal attention to it. So not surprisingly, there isn't a lot happening in education systems outside of the natural sciences, which is one of the agendas for UNESCO, which I propose also for you as human rights educators. Even if you're not teaching biology or environmental sciences, there are things we can do in our classrooms that relate to climate change. And I also want to say that even despite the fact that there's so little happening in national curriculum, the majority of teachers and students do believe that climate change is occurring and that climate change education is absolutely necessary. So let me move really in the last couple of minutes, let me move to what I'm working on now. I'm working on UNESCO's Greening Curriculum Guidance. It's not a curriculum resource. It's more sort of like a framework of key concepts, learning key ideas and learning outcomes that can be kind of a resource for curriculum developers and educators interested to address climate change in some ways. And the goal is that all UNESCO member states have mainstreamed education for sustainable development and climate change as a curriculum component by 2030, which is the next deadline for the SDGs. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this because I do think it's interesting. I mean, I'm learning as I go along myself. So in order to sort of push climate change education outside of the natural sciences, UNESCO has recognized 3 different domains for teaching about what essentially is ESD and CCE. The first, which is at the top of this triangle, is the environment, of course, very, very important. And inside of this, we find numerous topics related to climate science and thinking about ecosystems and diversity. So that's primarily the natural sciences, very important domain related to ESD and climate change education. But then if we move to the lower left-hand corner, we see that there's another domain called society, in which we can find many of the things which are very clearly related in my mind to the kinds of typical human rights work, the education work we do. For example, thinking about climate justice or resilience building in terms of addressing climate change individually. It's not just resilience building in terms of our individual capacities to cope with this incredible anxiety and existential threat of climate change, but also resilience in terms of thinking about how we can influence our governments to institute policies that will successfully help to mitigate the negative effects of human behavior. So society, a very important dimension. And finally, lower right-hand corner, the economy. It's obviously the economy, private sector efforts are also very essential for addressing climate change in a comprehensive way. And so there are topics related to carbon economies and what we're calling sustainable lifestyles. All of this, of course, thinking about whole school approach to greening, very much similar to human rights education ways of thinking. So those of you in human rights education, if we think about mapping climate change education on top of it, what we can think of is that we still need to work across, transdisciplinary, not just social sciences in the case of HRE, but working across other domains, finding relevant and meaningful links with human rights. And we have the same kind of agenda with climate change education. And I would argue with the human rights perspective on it, it creates an additional imperative and another sort of a dimension of climate change education, which is really, really important. Just to give you an idea before I wrap up on the kind of language that's going to be in this new guidance note, and we just finished the first draft in August, and the final draft is due to be released next summer, just so don't hold your breaths, but it's coming out fairly soon. But this gives you an idea of the thinking that's happening here, which I consider very much human rights thinking. Climate justice is identified in climate change education as addressing the underlying social, political, and economic drivers of the climate crisis and working to transform harmful relations of power, structures of oppression, and systems of discrimination that are at the root of the disproportionate burden of climate risks on marginalized communities. That's certainly very human rights related. That gives you a flavor for how climate justice is going to be addressed. And again, my point for bringing that up is to just show you that even inside of this guidance note, human rights is very much a part of the thinking. And I argue that you can also think of many creative ways, I think, to link up with each of these domains, environment, society, and economy, in what you do. So I'd like to encourage all of you to think about human rights, ESD, climate change education, and your own work. And I also want to recognize that our young people have incredible eco-anxiety. I mean, maybe you do as well as an adult, but certainly our young people do. And part of what we are doing in this new guidance note is talking about climate resilience. And what we're also being very mindful about, which you would also need to be as well, if I may say so, is making sure that we don't really end up in creating more depression and nihilism amongst our young people, but putting them on projects and things they can do, actual practices, thinking about greening jobs that will make a difference, that they will actually be making a contribution, and that they'll feel that they have something to offer, just as we as educators maybe also need to feel like we have something to offer in this very, very challenging period. Thank you again for listening to me, and I wish you a great, successful conference today.